Have you ever noticed that some people walk into a room and immediately feel different? They're not louder, they're not trying to impress anyone, they're not forcing conversation, but the atmosphere shifts. People listen a little more carefully. Interruptions decrease, the energy stabilizes. That's authority. And most people misunderstand where it comes from. Authority is not volume, it's not dominance, it's not intimidation. Real authority is felt before it's heard. It's sensed in posture, pacing, eye contact, and restraint. It's built through internal discipline long before it's expressed externally. The problem is that most people unintentionally lower their own authority every single day. They speak too quickly when challenged. They over-explain when questioned. They laugh nervously when tension appears. They fill silence immediately because silence feels uncomfortable. They rush to agree so they're perceived as easy to work with. None of these behaviors are dramatic, but collectively they signal something subtle: insecurity. And insecurity weakens authority faster than anything else. Authority is not about controlling others. It's about controlling yourself so consistently that others adjust naturally. When someone reacts quickly, talks excessively, or seeks validation openly, they reveal internal movement. And when there is visible internal movement, there is less perceived stability. People instinctively trust stability. They follow calm. They respect measured energy. They respond to someone who appears grounded even when pressure rises. Think about leaders you've respected. It wasn't their intensity that commanded attention. It was their steadiness. When tension increased, they didn't spike emotionally. When challenged, they didn't rush to defend. When silence entered the room, they didn't scramble to fill it. That composure creates gravity, and gravity changes dynamics without effort. The Stoics understood this deeply. Marcus Aurelius governed an empire under war, plague, betrayal, and political tension. Yet his private writings reveal constant reminders to remain steady, to govern emotion, to avoid unnecessary reaction. Because he knew that self-governance precedes influence. If you cannot manage your own emotional tempo, you cannot project authority consistently. Over the next several segments, I'm going to walk you through 7 silent signals that instantly increase your authority in any environment. These are not tricks. They are structural adjustments, subtle behaviors that communicate confidence without arrogance, discipline without coldness, presence without performance. Authority doesn't need to be announced, it needs to be structured. And once you structure it internally, the external response changes automatically. Before we get into the first signal, you need to understand the foundation. Because authority is not a surface-level behavior. It's not a posture trick or a voice technique alone. It's the external expression of internal order. If your internal world is chaotic, if you're easily offended, easily rushed, easily flattered, easily intimidated, no amount of surface-level adjustment will hold under pressure. Authority begins with self-governance. The Stoics were clear about this. You cannot influence others if you are not first in control of yourself. Marcus Aurelius didn't write about controlling people. He wrote about controlling impressions. Epictetus didn't focus on commanding rooms. He focused on commanding reactions. Because when your emotions are predictable, you are influenceable. And when you are influenceable, your authority weakens. Think about what lowers authority most quickly: the need to be liked, the need to be right, the need to respond immediately, the need to prove yourself. Every one of those needs creates visible tension, and tension communicates insecurity. When someone speaks and constantly looks around for approval, authority drops. When someone is challenged and immediately defends themselves emotionally, authority drops. When someone fills every silence with nervous energy, authority drops. Why? Because authority is associated with stability. Stability signals safety, and humans instinctively respond to safety with attention and trust. If you need validation in the moment, your energy becomes reactive. And reactive energy feels light. It moves quickly. It spikes. It adjusts to the room instead of anchoring it. But when you are internally ordered, when your opinions don't depend on applause, when your pace doesn't depend on pressure, when your tone doesn't depend on tension, you become steady. And steady people create gravity. Gravity is subtle. It's not loud. It's not aggressive. It simply changes how others move around you. Conversations slow slightly. Interruptions decrease. Eye contact holds longer. People wait for you to finish speaking, not because you demanded it, but because your energy suggests it. That's the foundation of everything we're about to cover. These 7 signals will only work if they're built on internal discipline. You can't fake stillness if you're panicking inside. You can't fake measured speech if you're desperate to be understood. You can't fake calm under pressure if your identity depends on winning the exchange. Authority is not an act, it's alignment. When your internal state is stable, your external behavior reflects it naturally. And when that reflection becomes consistent, people respond differently, not because you force them to, but because stability attracts attention, and attention, when sustained, becomes authority. Signal number 1, control the pace of your speech. Nothing reveals internal state faster than speed. When people feel uncertain, pressured, or eager for approval, they speak faster. Their words begin to stack. Sentences blur together. They rush to finish thoughts before someone interrupts. They fill gaps before silence has a chance to breathe. And without realizing it, they signal anxiety. Speed communicates urgency. Urgency communicates pressure. And pressure lowers perceived authority. Authority moves differently. It is measured, deliberate, unhurried. When someone speaks at a controlled pace, even under tension, it signals confidence in their position. It suggests they are not afraid of interruption, not afraid of disagreement, not afraid of silence. They don't race to secure their spot in the conversation. They assume it. Think about courtroom attorneys, experienced executives, or seasoned negotiators. The most commanding ones rarely rush. They pause between sentences. They let points land. They allow silence to stretch just slightly longer than feels comfortable. That pause does 2 things. First, it gives weight to what was said. Second, it shifts attention back to them without effort. Silence, when controlled, increases authority. Rushed speech leaks it. There's also a psychological layer here. When you speak quickly, listeners unconsciously assume you're trying to convince them. Convincing energy feels defensive. Measured speech feels certain. Certainty doesn't beg for agreement. It presents and waits. The Stoics practiced this in their own way. They valued precision and restraint in language. Words were tools, not emotional outlets. If you rush, you dilute impact. If you slow down, each word carries more density. Slowing your speech doesn't mean dragging it. It means removing unnecessary speed, removing filler phrases, removing frantic transitions, finishing sentences fully, breathing before continuing. When someone challenges you and you slow down slightly, instead of speeding up, you shift the dynamic immediately. You are not reacting to pressure. You are governing it. There is a simple exercise for this. The next time you speak in a meeting or conversation, intentionally pause for half a second before responding to a question. That pause will feel longer to you than it appears to others, but it communicates thoughtfulness instead of reactivity. It shows that your response is chosen, not triggered. Over time, this pacing becomes natural. Your tone steadies. Your words carry more weight. Interruptions decrease because your cadence signals completion. People wait because your rhythm commands it. Authority doesn't rush. It doesn't scramble. It doesn't compete for airtime. It speaks as if it expects to be heard. And when your pace reflects that expectation, others begin to treat it as reality. Signal number 2, stillness under pressure. Most people think authority is expressed through action gestures, emphasis, strong tone. But real authority is often expressed through what doesn't move. The micro reactions you show when tension enters a room reveal more than your words ever will. A raised eyebrow, a tight jaw, a defensive lean forward, a nervous smile. These small shifts tell people whether you are grounded or shaken. And once someone senses you are shaken, even slightly, your authority weakens. Stillness communicates control. When someone challenges you and your posture doesn't collapse or spike, that steadiness shifts the room. When criticism lands and your face doesn't tighten, people notice. When tension rises and you don't fidget, cross your arms defensively, or over-gesture to regain ground, you create contrast. And contrast creates presence. Most people move more when they feel threatened. They adjust in their seat. They interrupt. They over-gesture. They speak louder. It's a subconscious attempt to reclaim control. But the more movement you introduce under pressure, the more you reveal internal instability. Authority moves less when challenged, not more. The Stoics trained this discipline internally first. They practiced observing their reactions instead of obeying them. If anger rose, they noticed it before expressing it. If embarrassment appeared, they slowed instead of accelerating. That pause between emotion and action preserved composure. And composure is visible. In practical terms, this means when someone questions you publicly, you don't rush to defend. You maintain posture. You maintain eye contact. You allow the statement to settle before responding. You don't interrupt them mid-sentence to correct. You let them finish. That stillness forces others to lean in rather than push forward. It also transfers subtle pressure back into the room, because when someone tries to provoke movement and gets none, the imbalance becomes visible. There's a psychological principle here. Humans unconsciously assess hierarchy based on who adjusts to whom. If you adjust your posture, tone, or tempo every time someone introduces tension, you signal reactivity. If you remain steady and others adjust their volume, their pacing, or their energy to match you, you signal stability. Stability sits higher in the hierarchy. This doesn't mean you become rigid. It means you eliminate unnecessary movement. You speak with your hands less. You shift your body less. You let your eyes hold contact without darting away. And when silence appears, you don't rush to break it. Stillness under pressure is powerful because it suggests you are not threatened, and people rarely test what doesn't appear threatened. Over time, this becomes part of your baseline presence. When tension rises, you don't spike, you stabilize, and that stabilization changes the entire emotional climate of the room. Authority isn't loud, it's grounded, and grounded energy doesn't need to move to prove itself. Signal number 3, selective attention. This is where authority becomes unmistakable. Attention is currency. Where you direct it signals what has value. Most people give attention too freely. They react to every comment. They engage every provocation. They respond to every side remark. They laugh at jokes that don't deserve laughter. They defend against minor challenges that don't require defense. And without realizing it, they elevate low-value behavior by feeding it with energy. Authority is selective. It does not respond to everything. It does not chase every opinion. It does not reward every interruption with engagement. When you control where your attention goes, you control hierarchy in the room. If someone makes a dismissive comment and you immediately pivot your focus back to the main conversation, instead of engaging the remark, you lower the value of that comment without confrontation. If someone attempts to undermine you and you calmly redirect your attention to someone contributing constructively, you elevate substance over noise. That shift is subtle but powerful. The Stoics practiced selective engagement constantly. They did not argue with every critic. They did not chase every insult. They asked a simple question internally: does this deserve my energy? If the answer was no, they withdrew attention. And withdrawal of attention is often more powerful than rebuttal. Psychologically, people respond to reinforcement. If behavior receives engagement, it continues. If it receives indifference, it weakens. When someone tries to provoke you and you withhold reaction, they are left without reward. That absence creates friction on their side instead of yours. Selective attention also elevates your presence because it signals discernment. You are not scattered. You are not easily distracted. You focus on what matters and let the rest fade. That communicates internal clarity, and clarity builds authority. In practical terms, this means you don't answer every challenge immediately. You don't jump into every debate. You don't feel obligated to validate every perspective in the room. You choose where to engage. And when you do engage, you do so fully and deliberately. There is another layer here. When you laugh lightly at everything, agree reflexively, or nod excessively, you dilute your attention. But when your engagement is measured, when your nod means agreement and your silence means evaluation, your reactions carry weight. People begin to read your attention as meaningful rather than automatic. Authority isn't about dominating conversation. It's about controlling the value of your engagement. When your attention becomes intentional instead of reactive, people adjust. Because now, earning your engagement feels different than automatically receiving it. And that shift changes the social structure without a single aggressive move. Signal number 4, reduce verbal volume and increase verbal precision. Authority is rarely verbose. It doesn't ramble. It doesn't circle the point. It doesn't stack 5 explanations on top of one clear statement. When people feel uncertain, they tend to talk more. They add qualifiers. They soften their language. They repeat themselves in slightly different ways to make sure they're understood. I just think maybe what we could possibly consider doing is... That kind of language leaks authority. It signals hesitation. It signals the need for approval. And the more words you use to defend a simple idea, the lighter that idea feels. Authority speaks in completion, clear sentences, clean endings, no unnecessary filler. When someone asks for your opinion and you respond with a concise, structured answer, it feels grounded. When you stop speaking at the end of your point instead of trailing off into extra clarification, it signals certainty. Silence after a complete sentence is powerful. It shows you are comfortable letting your words stand. The Stoics valued precision in language because precision reflects clarity of thought. If your thinking is ordered, your speech becomes ordered, and ordered speech carries weight. If your thinking is scattered, your speech reveals it. Most people undermine their own authority by over-talking. They assume more words equal more credibility. In reality, more words often equal more exposure. Every additional explanation opens a new angle for challenge. Every extra sentence dilutes the impact of the first one. Brevity increases density. Density increases authority. There's also a pacing component here. When you finish your thought and stop, instead of immediately adding another layer, you create space. That space forces others to process what you said. It subtly shifts the conversational balance. You're no longer chasing understanding. You're allowing understanding to come to you. In practical terms, this means eliminating filler phrases like "I guess," "kind of," "maybe," or "just." It means stating, "This is the direction I recommend," instead of "I think maybe this could work." It means ending a sentence firmly instead of lifting your tone at the end as if asking for permission. It also means resisting the urge to jump back in and clarify unless clarification is truly necessary. Over time, fewer words create stronger presence. People begin to listen more carefully because they know you won't repeat yourself unnecessarily. Your statements feel deliberate instead of reactive. Authority is not about speaking the most. It's about speaking with structure. When your words are fewer but more intentional, they carry more weight. And weight changes how people respond to you. Signal number 5. Set clear boundaries without emotional charge. Nothing reveals internal insecurity faster than defensive boundaries. When someone says, "Don't talk to me like that," with visible irritation, the message may be valid, but the delivery weakens it. Emotional spikes signal that you were moved, and when others see they can move you, authority drops slightly. Clear boundaries delivered calmly do the opposite. They communicate self-respect without volatility. Authority doesn't beg for respect, it assumes it, and when that assumption is challenged, it responds with clarity, not agitation. If someone interrupts you repeatedly, you don't snap. You say, "Let me finish," and you continue. No extra tone, no lecture, just completion. If someone pushes your availability, you don't over-explain. You say, "I'm not available for that," and you stop. The boundary stands because your energy stands. The Stoics understood that emotional neutrality strengthens principle. If your boundary depends on emotion to feel real, it becomes inconsistent. But if your boundary is grounded in internal standard, it remains steady regardless of external pressure. That steadiness is what people respond to. There is a psychological pattern here. People test intensity, but they respect consistency. If your reaction fluctuates, calm one day, irritated the next, the structure feels unstable. But if your boundary is delivered the same way every time, it becomes predictable. Predictability creates respect, not because people fear you, because they understand you. Clear boundaries without emotional charge also reduce escalation. When someone expects confrontation and receives calm firmness, instead, it lowers the temperature of the exchange. It subtly transfers emotional responsibility back to them. If they escalate, they look reactive. You remain composed, and composure under challenge reinforces authority. In practical terms, this means eliminating apologetic tone from necessary boundaries. It means avoiding excessive justification. It means not smiling nervously after asserting a limit. Your face stays neutral, your voice stays steady, your posture stays open. The message becomes, this is simply how it is. Authority doesn't negotiate its standards publicly. It enforces them quietly and consistently. Over time, people stop testing where there is no emotional leverage. They sense that pushing will not produce drama. It will simply meet structure. And structure is far harder to challenge than emotion. When your boundaries are clear and calm, your presence becomes heavier, not aggressive, just grounded. And grounded authority doesn't need to raise its voice to be respected. Signal number 6, master strategic silence. Most people are uncomfortable with silence. When a question is asked, they rush to answer. When tension appears, they rush to fill it. When a statement lands awkwardly, they scramble to smooth it over. That reflex lowers authority instantly. Because whoever breaks the silence first usually feels the pressure first. Authority is comfortable letting silence breathe. When you finish a statement and stop instead of nervously adding more, you create space. That space shifts attention back to you. It forces others to process what was said instead of rushing past it. In negotiations, in meetings, in difficult conversations, the person who can hold silence calmly controls the tempo. Tempo control equals influence. The Stoics practiced restraint not only in emotion but in speech. They understood that not every thought requires immediate expression. When you allow silence to sit after someone challenges you, you transfer tension back into the room. You show that you are not uncomfortable. And discomfort management is authority. If someone makes a provocative remark and you simply look at them for a moment before responding, that pause alone can recalibrate the exchange. It communicates evaluation instead of reaction. Silence becomes a tool, not an accident. Signal number 7, delay reaction. This is different from silence. Silence is external. Delayed reaction is internal. When something unexpected happens, criticism, interruption, disagreement, most people respond immediately. Their face shifts, their tone changes, their body tightens. That micro-reaction lowers status because it reveals emotional movement. Authority introduces a half-second delay. That brief gap between stimulus and visible response creates control. You hear the comment, you process it, you choose your expression. That choice is subtle but powerful. It signals composure. People instinctively watch for reaction. When they don't get an immediate spike, the power dynamic stabilizes in your favor. Delayed reaction also prevents escalation. If someone is testing you emotionally and they see immediate agitation, they escalate. If they see calm processing, they often soften, not because they're intimidated, but because the emotional feedback loop has been interrupted. Over time, these two signals, silence and delayed reaction, reshape how others experience you. You become harder to read emotionally, harder to provoke, harder to rush. That difficulty doesn't create distance, it creates gravity. People lean in more carefully. They choose words more intentionally. They adjust their pace unconsciously. And you didn't dominate the room. You governed yourself. Authority is not about volume or force. It's about tempo and composure. When you control both, the room adjusts to you. And adjustment is the clearest sign of influence. Let's bring this together at the right level. Authority is not something you declare. It's something you structure. You don't command it with volume. You don't demand it with aggression. You don't manufacture it with performance. You build it through internal discipline that becomes externally visible. When you control your pace of speech, you signal confidence. When you remain still under pressure, you signal stability. When you direct your attention selectively, you signal discernment. When you reduce verbal volume and increase precision, you signal clarity. When you enforce boundaries calmly, you signal self-respect. When you master silence and delay reaction, you signal composure. None of these are dramatic, but together they create gravity. And gravity is what people mistake for natural authority. It's not natural, it's structured. The Stoics understood that the only real control you ever have is over yourself, and when that control becomes consistent, others feel it. Not because you try to dominate them, but because you don't need to. You don't scramble for validation. You don't rush to defend every point. You don't spike emotionally when tension rises. That steadiness shifts how people interact with you. Interruptions decrease, challenges soften, conversations become more measured. And here's the important part: you're not manipulating the room, you're stabilizing yourself. When you're internally ordered, the external environment often reorganizes around you. Authority is simply the byproduct of composure plus consistency. It's what happens when your reactions aren't easily purchased and your attention isn't easily captured. Most people try to increase authority by adding something louder: voice, stronger gestures, sharper language. Real authority often comes from subtraction: fewer words, fewer reactions, fewer emotional spikes, fewer unnecessary movements. The less chaotic your energy becomes, the more centered your presence feels. And centered presence commands respect quietly. So remember, this authority isn't about being the most intense person in the room. It's about being the most stable. Stability is rare, and rare qualities stand out automatically. If this resonated, drop a comment below. Authority starts within. And if you're serious about building unshakable presence, stay with this series. Because power isn't something you perform, it's something you practice.